desk a couple times.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar. I am Jenny Liu, a faculty member over at Urban Studies and Planning, and together with Professor Monsieur at Civil Engineering, we host this seminar. And today we're very happy to have Lidveen Rahman, who is a principal planner at ODOT, and also Jessica Horning, who is the Transit and Active Transportation Liaison at ODOT Region 1, here to talk to us about complete streets here, strategies for Oregon. So I will turn the floor over to our guests. Thank you.
We don't use that mic. Okay, well, hi. Thank you for being here. We're going to be talking about complete streets, policy planning and implementation. So not just building complete streets, but everything that goes into getting to complete streets. And then we'll be presenting some implementation tools. I've given parts of this talk to activists at the Oregon Active Transportation Summit and to local planners at the Oregon Planning Institute, which is kind of both sides of the complete streets issue. It requires bottom-up advocacy if you think complete streets are a good idea, and it requires top-down policies and standards to make it happen. So what are complete streets? Complete streets are streets that are accessible and easy to use for everyone. That means they're designed and operated for safe use by all modes: pedestrian, bicyclists, transit users, automobiles, and also all people, people of all ages and abilities and all kinds of backgrounds. Why do complete streets matter? Well, streets are a big part of urban space. I just got a number this morning. Metro did an analysis of the amount of the land area in the metro area that's taken up by right-of-way, and it is close to 19 or 20% of our land area is taken up by public right-of-way for streets. So it's a huge occupier of space. Streets are not just our corridors for getting from A to B, they're also our living spaces, our living rooms. Streets have many functions, yet in the U.S., in this day and age, many streets are designed primarily for cars and continue to be improved for cars only. Having complete streets is a good idea to meet many goals that cities and counties and the state have. Offering transportation choices by accommodating all modes, accommodating the needs of all users, which includes the young, the old, the disabled, and those who take care of the young, the old, and the disabled, and sometimes are the young, the old, and the disabled, which is women. And what makes a good street for women is not always the same as what makes a complete streets. So, you know, every user has their own needs. Safety. If you don't build complete streets, they're not safe because people will walk and ride their bikes. They just can't do it safely when the sidewalk's not there, the crossing's not there. People will use the bus, and if they get on the bus on one side of the street, they have to be able to get across the street to get home at the end of the day, or vice versa. And unfortunately, many crashes happen when people use the street that's not designed for their use. More reasons why I think complete streets matter. To help meet greenhouse gas reduction targets by reducing vehicle miles traveled, to improve public health outcomes by encouraging active transportation, that's walking and biking and also walking to the bus. So transit is an extension or a part of active transportation. By providing safe and convenient access to public transit, so supporting transit. And by offering, since we both work for ODOT, offering alternatives to the use of state highways for trips that don't belong on state highways, for the short trips that can easily be done by other modes. So this is kind of an illustration of all the functions that that streets fulfill in our urban environment. And I am talking mostly about urban environment. There is a National Complete Streets Institute that has been advocating for complete streets policies and is kind of tracking the adoption of complete streets policies and plans, et cetera, all over the country. So they came up with a list of 10 elements that a good complete streets policy should have. And they have, on the National Complete Streets Coalition website, there's a number of resources. They define these elements. They've also done a lot of research. They've had a couple of annual reports out now where they're keeping track of who's adopted and what are good examples of complete streets policy. And I'll go over each of these in the context of Oregon. In Oregon, the policy framework for complete streets consists of primarily the bike bill, the transportation planning rule, and the local transportation system plans. The bike bill, ORS 366514, is actually it's considered one of the original complete streets policies in the nation. As we'll see, it's not very complete, but it does say whenever you expend state gas tax funds on reconstruction of a road, you will accommodate bicycles and pedestrians unless there are specific exceptions. And if one of those exceptions applies, like on a freeway, as a state, we have to spend a minimum of 1% on bike and ped. So we count, the bike ped elements of roadway projects towards that, but if we don't reach 1%, the rest of it goes into a grant pot of money. And so a lot of people think the bike bill is about spending 1% on bike and pedestrian facilities. That's not actually what the bill says. It says whenever you reconstruct a street, you will accommodate bicycles and pedestrians, and at a minimum of 1%, you can certainly spend more. The transportation planning rule has a number of elements in it that apply to complete streets, and I'll go through each of those. And then all that gets reflected in local transportation system plans. So if you're an advocate or a planner, if you want to know whether we have a complete streets policy in Portland or Gresham or Tigard or whatever, you have to look at this is the framework, but you have to analyze the plan that you're engaged with at that point and the practices to see whether there is in fact a complete streets policy in place or not. So I mentioned some resources on the Complete Streets Coalition network. Last year, I had an intern help me with some research looking at what's happening in Oregon at the state and local level with complete streets. And these are kind of our conclusions. So the first element is that a complete streets policy must set a vision and have a clear statement of intent. Do we have that in Oregon? Maybe. It depends. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There is nothing in the transportation planning rule or the bike bill that says you have to have complete streets policy. And so that is probably not there. Complete streets, the term is relatively new. It's been around for a while now, but there are not that many jurisdictions that actually, explicitly have a complete streets policy. Second, if you have a policy, does it include all modes and all users? I think in Oregon, most TSPs, transportation system plans, and do catch me if I use too many acronyms, do address all modes and all users. The TPR, the Transportation Planning Rule, requires it. It says all transportation system plans have to have a bike and a ped element and a transit element if there is transit available. And all TSPs must meet the needs of the transportation disadvantaged, although I'm not sure that everybody has given that a whole lot of thought. Again, it varies from city to city. And I would add to that, it's one thing to pay lip service and put in a paragraph, just like they put in a paragraph about pipeline and marine transportation. It's a whole other thing to actually meaningfully address the needs of all modes and all users. And one thing that it requires is that you include representatives of all user types and all modes in your process. And that's going to take some work. That's not automatic. Those are not everybody is, on your typical citizen advisory committee. You have to go to where they are and make sure they get meaningful opportunity for input. Oops. The policy and practice should emphasize connected and complete networks. So it's not just about having every street accommodate every use. It's about developing networks for each mode, and they have to be connected. Not, you can't be left hanging when all of a sudden there's nothing there. Whether there are complete networks or not, again, varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The TPR requires local street connectivity. That can be in the form of standards in the development code, but it doesn't really require. It requires a network of arterials and connectors, but it doesn't really require a network of local streets in the plan. The TPR does require that local design standards call for bike lanes and sidewalks on arterials and collectors, and doesn't say much about local streets, and that's fine. It doesn't address crossings. There's nothing in the TPR about crossings, and I've participated in a lot of TSPs. One part of what I do is I work for the Transportation and Growth Management Program, and we fund a lot of TSPs. And the crossing piece is what's often left out. I mean, they look at the streets, they see where there are sidewalks and where there's not, and then the gaps are, what needs to be filled in. But it's not good enough to have sidewalks, even if you do have sidewalks on both sides, but you can't get across. That's not good enough. So that's something that's often lacking. The TPR also doesn't talk about how to resolve trade-offs between modes when you have limited space and everything, when you have limited streets and every mode has to be accommodated on one street. How do you make the choices about what's the priority? And that's something some jurisdictions are doing, but not everyone, and it's not mandated by state law. Does it apply to all roads? The framework in Oregon does apply to all roads, regardless of jurisdictions. But does it apply to both new and retrofit projects? And that's where in Oregon we're having a big gap in complete streets policy. The bike bill, the Great Bike Bill, the original complete streets policy in the United States only applies to reconstruction or new roads. It doesn't apply to preservation or paving jobs. And in this day and age of limited funds, which is true at the federal, state, regional, and local level, there's a tendency to just do pavement. And there isn't a lot of what's called mod money or modernization money to add things that are not there. So in reality, the bike bill only applies to a very, very small percent of road projects, because the bulk of the money is being spent on maintenance, and the city of Portland is having a lively conversation about, what should the spending priorities be, and moving towards maintenance. But that's a problem when you don't have a complete system yet. Number 6, does the policy specify and limit exceptions, which the bike bill does do, and I won't go over those right now, but I'm happy to if you have questions. Does it use the latest design standards Did I not get it? Thank you. My Vanna. There's nothing at the state level in the policy framework about design standards, or very little. There's a little bit in the TPR about not making streets wider than they have to be. So street design standards vary from city to city, and a lot of times the issue is design speed. Even the state highway design manual has good standards. They vary for urban versus rural. There's special transportation areas where pedestrians are supposed to have the priority, but if the posted speed and the design is 45 miles an hour, that's usually, the speed is usually the issue that people want to change to make for a street that's more comfortable for walking and bicycling, and that's not an option to change the design speed. So there's another gap there. Is it context sensitive? Again, it depends. Nothing in state law or policy that dictates it. Metro has very context-sensitive design guidelines, the Metro Livable Streets document. The state of Oregon certainly distinguishes between urban, rural, and then has these special designations. But a lot of jurisdictions have design specs that are based on the vehicular functional class, arterial, collector, local, etc., rather than is this a downtown or is this wide open country. And another issue is there is the planned context versus the existing context. And an issue that we often run into is that engineers are looking at what you see right now. Does it look urban? Does it send the message to the driver that there's people here who might want to cross or walk? So even though something's inside the urban growth boundary, if it's not built up yet, then it's a bit of a battle to get a complete street in place. Does the policy set measurable performance standards? And that's something we do not have in the state of Oregon right now. There may be individual jurisdictions that do, but the TPR actually has a standard that requires a reduction in single occupancy vehicles. That the plan, the TSP, must result in a reduction in SOV. And to my knowledge, and I've been at this for a long time, that really hasn't been enforced at all. Right now, there's a lot of work going on with the greenhouse gas climate change, and will likely lead to a stronger requirement to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, but that's not worked its way into transportation system plans and street design yet. In reality, the one and only standard that is enforced is a mobility standard, a level of service or vehicle to capacity standard for vehicles. And because that's the only hard and fast standard, that's the one that tends to get enforced. So I'm not being neutral in my conclusions here. I'm being an advocate. And then finally, does it include specific next steps for implementation? And again, that varies hugely from plan to plan and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So conclusions, especially for advocates, but also for planners, if you think complete streets matter, these are the things you probably want to work on. Have a complete streets policy in the plan, and it's not good enough to have a good bike plan and a good ped plan. You have to have it at the top level. Because that's a tendency to say, oh, well, we take care of that. We have a bike coordinator and a ped coordinator, and we have a bike plan and a ped plan, and you do your own thing. And meanwhile, we'll just do all this car stuff. So you have to have it at the top level. Plan for complete networks. And sometimes that might mean, and Jessica will talk about that the bikes are not on the same street as the bus and the pedestrians, but it's important that each network is complete, that you actually get places. have a performance standard, and that can be like system completeness. It can also be, there's many, we'll talk later about performance standards. Apply that standard to project selection. And again, not just how do you pick the best pedestrian projects or how do you pick the best bicycle projects, but how do you spend all your money on all your projects and make, completeness a factor in making those decisions. Identify a funding strategy for retrofitting incomplete streets, and I was referring to that later. If all we're doing is maintaining the system we have, we'll never get there. And apply the policy to design. And with that, I think we're shifting to Jessica. Where is it?
Not wearing a very microphone compatible outfit today, but no, I'll figure it out. All right. So Lidvine's been talking a lot about the policy element of complete streets and some of the gaps that we have in between the relying on the complete streets policy and getting us to actual on-the-ground implementation of complete streets. So what I'm going to go through now is just talk about some of the basic elements of complete streets implementation that we found have been really helpful to try to address more thoroughly as you go through your planning process and your project development process. A lot of examples of how we've incorporated these elements into local transportation system plans. And when we put this together, it was really focused on, our main audience was local jurisdictions, and this was kind of a scoping guidance presentation. But I think as a predominantly student audience, it's a really good series of examples too, because a lot of these, as we go through them, you'll see are pretty basic GIS exercises that you can add on to the typical work that goes into transportation system planning. So could be good class project material or something like that. So the first piece that we really have tried to address when implementing complete streets through planning processes has been network planning. Traditionally, when we've put together transportation system plans for local at all different levels, we've really focused on functional classification for vehicles, and we'll look at the arterials and collectors, and on all arterials and collectors, we'll have accommodations, we'll have sidewalks for pedestrians, and we'll have bike lanes for bikes, which is a great starting point for just getting some infrastructure, but we can't always put all of the users on arterials. It can almost actually exacerbate the problem of we're trying to cram everybody on these same arterials and collectors, so we're making the streets even wider to make complete streets. So what we found has been that in the planning process, it's really helpful to define layered networks where you've got different functional classes for all of your modes. And the City of Portland does this really well. They've got a different functional classification for bikes. So is it a city walkway or a so they've got different functional classification for bikes, for pedestrians, for emergency vehicles, for freight, and for cars and transit. I think there's 7 different layers, maybe. Somebody from City of Portland could probably confirm this. But they've also got the Neighborhood Greenways program or network, which has been really great for identifying a separate network of bicycle and pedestrian-friendly routes that utilize your low-speed, low-volume existing network and completing the streets that way. Because a lot of the time when you really focus on, well, we'll put bike lanes on all the arterials, yeah, you're making a bike network, but it's a bike lane next to 5 lanes of traffic that only your strong and fearless riders are going to use. So this alternative network planning approach is really helpful in terms of not only utilizing what you've got in terms of infrastructure, but also attracting a new group of users. And the city's had really positive feedback from that, results from that approach. The Metro Mobility Corridors approach is kind of similar. This is the approach that Metro has taken for the region in the Regional Transportation Plan. And again, this looks at accommodating all users, but within a corridor, not necessarily all on one arterial. So take, for example, the corridor between Portland Central City and Milwaukee. You've got the Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail Corridor, McLaughlin Boulevard that provides your freight and auto mobility, the trolley trail, and parallel routes that are low-stress pedestrian and bicycle. And this also has an influence on the land use and development patterns in the area, too. Connectivity is the next big area that we've really worked with local jurisdictions on in the planning process. Again, just looking beyond the arterials and collectors and making sure that not only are these streets complete, but you've got a dense grid of local streets to provide the connections. Let's see, is there a pointer here? Because in this development in the top, you can have sidewalks on this connection here and on your main arterial, but there's no direct connections, and everybody is still, no matter what type of trip you're making, from a residential to residential, or from residential to commercial down here, you're all using this same stretch of roadway, so you have to keep on widening it. And we're really finding, yeah, and it's a longer distance trip out of direction. So really starting to look at some of the short connections that you can make within your network that are going to have a much greater impact on connectivity and access than just focusing on, having an arterial every 1 mile within your network. And redundancy, basically this creates greater connectivity, a finer grained network, and redundancy, which can be very helpful because then not only do you have different routes that you can take for different trip types, but you don't need to have that huge capacity on one route because if something happens on one street, you've got other routes that you can take around it. So this is one example of a GIS exercise that we did for Prince George's County in Maryland. This is the Blue Line Metro Rail corridor that goes from Washington, D.C. out into a suburban area. And we're just visualizing, in an ideal network, this is these are the areas that you could walk to from each metro station in 5, 10, 15, or 5, 10, and 20 minutes. But when you look at your actual street network, it doesn't actually, what you can access doesn't look anything like that. So we really use this exercise at public meetings to start looking at what are the really short connections like this that you can make with your constrained budget as a city to maximize access and connectivity around your transit stations and really capitalize on that investment rather than continuing to widen this already 7-lane arterial here that connects all of them. Similarly, this isn't the greatest visual, but for the Lake Oswego TSP, when we're looking at pedestrian and bicycle connectivity, just took the first step of identifying what are the destinations that pedestrians and cyclists are going to be attracted to, that are going to be generating those types of trips, made just a half-mile buffer around them, looked at, in blue are the existing sidewalks, and you can really easily start to pick out, okay, we've got a gap right here that in our sidewalk network between a school and a residential neighborhood. We've got a gap right here between a school and a park. And just starting to visualize what some of these smaller connections are that are really going to make a bigger impact in your network. And This can be a really hard exercise to try to do, particularly if you're a consultant or you're new to an area. And these little connections, you have to know the neighborhood really well. So luckily, we have the combined forces of internet and community that can now be harnessed to help us with a lot of this work, which is what we did for the City of Tigard's Neighborhood Trails Plan. Basically just put together a free Google map of the city and asked people to mark, what are the shortcuts that you take? Where are the places where there isn't a connection or a street right now, but you walk through anyways, so it's something we could formalize to improve the network and complete the network. And think 80 of the 100 connections that ended up being in this approved plan came from this free online Google Map interface. So really effective approach. I'm going to hand it back to Lidveen for performance measures.
I can't see down that way. Can you hear me? Oh. So performance measures. So if you have your plan network and you know connectivity is important, how do you make sure it happens? And part of the answer is you have to have performance measures and you have to have standards. So measures is what you measure, and standard is where you draw the line between what's okay and what's not okay. You've all heard the saying that what measured is what matters, what gets measured. So if you don't measure it, it's invisible. Which is particularly true in transportation. And there's been so many tools and measurements that relate to automobiles and not a whole lot of tools and measures relating to active transportation and transit, a little more on transit. So it's important to move beyond those traditional measures. You might want to consider the triple bottom line of sustainability, environment, economy, and equity, and have some measures that relate to each of those. Specifically for active transportation, you want to consider system completeness and accessibility, which is something you can measure with GIS, like we just saw, and comfort. For all modes, and this is different from vehicle level of service. Well, level of service reflects comfort a little bit, but it's not about use or volume to capacity. It's about the experience of feeling safe and comfortable and having an attractive environment to walk and bike in. I know, I'm from Holland. There are situations there where we actually have congestions on the sidewalks and congestion on the bike lanes, but that is not our problem in Oregon. So it's not about volume, which is not to say that usage doesn't matter. It's just one of many measures to consider. And existing usage is not often a good measure, because if the system's not there, or people are smart enough not to be walking or riding their bike because it's so damn dangerous, then you want to be careful that that doesn't get used as an argument for not building the complete street that would make it safe to walk and ride there. If you are starting to get into performance measures, it's important to identify measures that directly relate to the jurisdiction's goals and policies and values, which are reflected in the goals and policies, that they're meaningful to citizens and to the decision makers, the elected officials or whoever, that they can be done consistently and that they're reproducible, so that the answer is the same regardless of who does the analysis or the measurement, and that they're appropriate for the context of what you're doing. And some of those contexts that measures are used for are in a transportation system plan to identify gaps, like something's not there, and deficiencies, whatever is there is not good enough. To compare alternatives, this one meets the goals and objectives better than this alternative. Also to compare before and after, which is something we really need to do more of to, again, make the case for why it pays off to build sidewalks, make connections, fix gaps, etc. To evaluate the adequacy of the plan as a whole. Does it reduce VMT? The whole package of everything. What does it do for mode share, etc. And to evaluate the impact of development. So there is a development review usage. And right now, as I said, the only measure in place is VC. So that's all that gets looked at, and that's, in order to meet it, you have to add capacity, is the typical way it goes. So there's been some work done on performance measures. There's actually quite a bit of work being done right now, both nationally but also in the region. ODAT did a research project that looked at kind of what's a menu of other measures that we might want to consider. So they haven't been adopted. They're more available for the region and cities in their TSPs or corridor plans to consider. And the ones that came out, especially for bicycle and pedestrian, are mode share, the system completeness. So it's not just percent of sidewalk. If you have X miles of road and 50% of that actually has sidewalks on it, it's percent of the planned network that's been completed. So if the bike facility is the parallel facility, like we heard about the Greenway, then that would be the one that needs to be complete. So it relates to the network again. And then on accessibility, and there's all kinds of neat ways that you can measure improvements in accessibility when you either put more people or put more facilities somewhere. And reliability, which is an issue not just for cars, but also for transit and also very much for freight. Last year, the Oregon Transportation Commission approved a set of amendments to the Oregon Highway Plan that opened the door to alternative mobility measures. The Commission didn't change the mobility standards that are in place, but opened the door for having additional or other measures instead of the VC measures, which is especially of interest in areas where we're already at or above a VC of 1.0, and it becomes a meaningless measure anyway at that point, and it may conflict with other objectives like compact, mixed use, multimodal, etc. ODAT has also, in the process of what used to be called least cost planning and is now called Mosaic, and it provides a tool, a spreadsheet tool, and then a lot of research went into the kind of default values with multiple criteria for how to evaluate system performance in either a big regional plan or a corridor plan. So the categories are, and these tend to be the categories that show up everywhere: mobility, accessibility, economic vitality, etc. There's a list there. And then there are specific measures. And there was a huge process with lots of stakeholders and experts to agree on the categories and then agree on the measures and consider the data availability, etc., etc. So yeah, measurement does presume data collection, and that's a good thing. It's not just getting the measure in place, but then reporting on performance over time. But data collection is also an opportunity to engage the public, to engage the stakeholders of all types, and to make the case for complete streets or whatever it is you want to make the case for. And Jessica's going to talk about more measures.
All right. I'm going to burn through a lot of this so that we have time for questions and discussion. So Lidbean talked a little bit about some of the efforts that we've had on the local level to look at alternative mobility measures. The good news is that this is also happening on the national level, and these types of alternative performance measures are being adopted into the national Bible guidebooks that transportation designers and engineers and planners use. The primary example of that being multimodal level of service, which is now in the 2010 Highway Capacity Manual. Mostly this considers whether you have facilities for bicycles and pedestrians is there some buffering between them in traffic, and what are the speeds and volumes of vehicles that they're being exposed to. It works really well in the transportation system planning process for looking at alternative cross-sections or design approaches for corridors, and looking at your network and where are the really good service level areas, where are the really bad service level areas that we want to build up more. Doesn't work so well for, site development review and looking at, we're adding 80 new cars. What's this going to do for the bicycles and pedestrians in the area? So the Highway Safety Manual is another national guide. Gives some really good tools in terms of crash modification factors. What are the safety impacts of complete streets improvements? And so those are some resources you can look at more. Design guidance is another big group of tools that we've been working on in a lot of TSPs, just because when you're looking at new objectives with your street network, you really need to look at new design treatments to be able to achieve those objectives. So this has been looking at more than just adding bike lanes to your cross-section of what are some of those traffic calming design elements and things like that you also want your designers and engineers to start considering. So this really involves a lot of ongoing staff education, just to keep people aware of what are the best practices and the practices you want them to be considering, as opposed to, this is an arterial, this is our arterial standard details, this is how we design it. Getting that continuing education of what are the new approaches and how are they appropriately applied, and a lot of the time putting together some sort of review checklists for projects so that you have documentation of what are the plans that you looked at when you did this design, what are the things that you considered, why are you going with the design approach that you're going with. And for Ashland in Oregon, as part of their TSP, when I was at Kittleson and Associates, they created a bicycle and pedestrian design toolkit as an addendum to their transportation system plan that basically just goes through this new toolkit of on-street bike parking, buffered bike lanes, things that they hadn't really been using as design tools before, and giving some guidance on what are the basic dimensions if you're going to use them in Ashland, where are the appropriate applications. Washington County's bike design toolkit, very similar, but just focused on bike facilities, but also gives a facility selection guide that says, based on the speeds and volumes of different streets, what are the types of bike facilities that you want to look at on different corridors, and provides streamlines the design exception process if you're going to use those facilities in the county. Philadelphia's Complete Streets Design Handbook takes a little bit different approach, where, unlike it still has its functional classification for streets for vehicles, but instead of doing the Portland approach, where it makes another functional classification for bikes and for pedestrians and for freight, it has a separate complete streets typology that comes with design guidance that is an overlay over the car functional classification that says, based on, we've got this vehicle functional classification, but it's also this type of surrounding land use, and a high priority for pedestrians, and a moderate priority for transit. So in the pedestrian realm, these are the types of design features you should consider. In the furnishing zone, these are the types of features you should consider. So it's a pretty thick guide, but a really interesting different approach. And Seattle has a complete streets checklist, as I mentioned, that for every project in Seattle, you go through this checklist and just document, did you look at the bike plan for the city and consider the improvements that that plan recommends for this project? And did you look at these other elements? So you can document what you've reviewed, and if you didn't pursue a particular plan or a particular treatment that was recommended in a plan, what's the reasoning, how are we going to reconsider getting to that approach in the future. Project prioritization is another big issue with implementing complete streets. There is a National Cooperative Highway Research Program research project going on right now called NCHRP 717 that is looking at what is a recommended approach for prioritizing bicycle and pedestrian retrofit projects on roadways. And this matrix is from that. Basically, we're finding that some people have really good quantitative approaches to identifying and prioritizing complete streets improvements. Some folks are just going completely based on opportunity. What can we fit in with our planned preservation projects? Yeah. And one example of a really quantitative approach in the local area has been Washington County got a grant from the Department of Energy to do a bicycle and pedestrian prioritization process where they're looking at first areas. This is a GIS analysis for the areas that they did, looking at land uses, density, some social factors, how supportive is this area of of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, will it be generating trips or have a high need, and then looking at, the overlay analysis of looking at, okay, in these high trip generating areas, where are gaps and where are opportunities there, and then doing a feasibility analysis to say, okay, we've got these gaps in these high need areas, which ones are doable, and generating a list of, I think it's about 25 to 50 priority projects out of this process. So a pretty quantitative approach that'll help them line up projects in the future. And last but certainly not least, funding is an issue to tackle not only in complete streets, but in all transportation decisions at this point. One place where we tend to get caught up a lot is with complete streets implementation is we have a corridor planning process. We envision our future cross-section for our complete streets corridor and step back and say, well, this is all going to be implemented as the area redevelops, which is great if you've got that network plan already done, if you've got your design standards for this new complete streets approach cross-section already implemented, and if your entire corridor is going to all redevelop in a short period of time, but very rarely does that happen. So one of the other funding measures that a lot of communities use is a transportation system development charge, where developers who come in pay a fee based on the number of trips they're going to generate, and that funding can be used to do more than just frontage improvements on their parcel that they're developing. It can be used to implement improvements that are needed along the whole corridor. The problem with that approach, and we have 10 minutes, so I'll be quick, is that a lot of those methodologies are just based on your IT trip generation manual estimates. Yeah, of how many vehicles is this development going to generate. So you have a legal problem of, well, this fee is based on vehicles. You can't use that fee to just do something for pedestrians. So as part of different communities' transportation system planning process or just as standalone projects, we've been working to develop some new system development charge methodologies that look at more than just your vehicle generation, your fee per vehicle trip. So this table is an example of Hubbard, which is a very small town on 99E down to Salem, that's looking at a per trip system development charge fee, so that because most of their improvements that they want to pursue in the city are sidewalk infill. So they've got both a motor vehicle charge and a non-motor vehicle charge that adds up to their total fee. Albany's looked at a sidewalk per capita base charge, so whatever development comes in, you pay a fee so that as your population grows, you still have the same amount of sidewalk to serve every resident. It's kind of an interesting one. So there's a lot of different approaches out there. So with that was a lot. But yeah, I'd be happy to discuss, answer questions.
Hi, so sort of going down to the funding issue, I know that ODOT has control of some streets and PBOT has control of some streets, and right now PBOT's facing a pretty harsh budget in terms of complete streets. They're proposing cutting basically all pedestrian and bike new infrastructure in the budget in favor of maintenance. And so I'm wondering, does ODOT have any way of mitigating some of the consequences of a PBOT budget that doesn't really allow for pedestrian and bike network connectivity?
Well, I think one way that ODOT and the local jurisdictions have been working together a little bit differently on the funding approach in the last year is how we've approached our ODOT's main funding planning process is the State Transportation Improvement Plan. We're currently planning our 2016 to 2018 STIP. And this is the first time that we've split all of our funds into two different pools that we're calling Fix It and Enhance It. And whereas we used to just look at individual projects and partner them up with individual little specific pools of federal funding, and we looked primarily at ODOT facilities for all of that funding. This time, the Enhance It pool is a lot of smaller federal and state funding funding pools that were for the modernization projects that Lidbean talked about, and transportation enhancements, which is ped bike and trails, and a state ped bike fund. We put that all together and let all of the jurisdictions and ODOT apply for what are the projects that they want to see get funded out of this pool. And I think this was the first year that it didn't have to be an ODOT facility, so there are some PBOT projects in there too.
That's correct. But I think it's only fair to say that ODOT doesn't have any money either. I mean, so we are all quibbling over a tiny pot of money. And yes, ODOT's opened it up. We've sort of erased the lines between the different pots of money, and some of those were eligible for local facilities, some were not. Now it's all wide open, and the theory is we'll just pick the best projects regardless, you know, jurisdiction blind, etc. But there's still very little money. So there's more to be done.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what ODOT might be doing to bring the state highways that are on surface streets more in line with these complete street principles that you've outlined.
That's Jessica's job. Deep sigh.
So particularly, urban arterials are pretty much the biggest challenge, in my opinion, in terms of ODOT facilities to work on. A lot of them not only need a lot of improvements in terms of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, but down to the very bones of Lombard and 82nd and, you know, the structure of the pavement, they need a lot of work. So on some of those facilities, historically, our approach, and this is funny that I'm saying historically in ODOT because I've been there 5.5 months. So take this all with a grain of salt. But that approach has been to look at whether you can do a jurisdictional transfer and partner with the local jurisdiction to do some improvements, and then they take it on and have more flexibility to do some of the active transportation design treatments than we do, since we need to use AASHTO and have some other, well, yeah.
The State Highway Design Manual.
Yeah. We just have a few more obstacles to getting to some of those designs. At Region 1, one of the things I've been tasked with my relatively new position has been to start working on a needs analysis for pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure and transit. And I think a lot of that's going to be looking at gaps in the network, where are hotspots for crash history, and a lot of that is probably going to be pinpointing some improvements on those corridors. So we're exploring a lot of new approaches right now to basically try to figure out what are the small improvements we can do that give us the most bang for our buck, since ODOT and the city and everyone's a little broke.
Okay, so speaking of money, you talked a lot about performance measures and how some that data collection is necessary to do that. Is that a challenge for having better performance standards or performance measures? And if so, how can citizens or activists or planners or engineers kind of try and move to allocate more funds for this important thing?
That is a challenge. And yes, advocates can, and you can do that by participating in the TSP. Portland's working on the comp plan now, and that's where the policy element is. And then the TSP will be next. All the jurisdictions in the region are working on their transportation system plans. Metro will start another update of the regional transportation plan. There are performance measures and targets in the RTP, and there's language that says the local jurisdictions, in order to be consistent with the RTP, have to meet these targets. There's, as I said, a lot of work happening with the climate change, so new measures it's going to take new measures to meet those greenhouse gas targets. Oregon is updating the Oregon Bike and Ped Plan, the policy element, and I think that's a huge opportunity to get some performance measures in there for the state. And yeah, it has to, like I said in the beginning, it has to come, from the bottom up and from the top down. Generally, I think on the top-down side, there is, because of scarce resources, there is a big interest in getting the most bang for the buck and being able to measure, effectiveness of spending the limited funds we have. So in that sense, it's a good time for performance measures, but it's still going to require a lot of on-the-ground work to get it right. And professionally, the predominance of the vehicle measures, is so strong that it does take bottoms up to counteract that, I think.
From the very, very top up, one of the things that folks who were at the National Bike Summit that ended yesterday were talking to legislators about was the performance measure requirements that are in MAP 21, the new federal transportation authorization, and figuring out what those measures are going to be and how they can be more multimodal, because the draft measures are very freight and car
oriented. Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about context-sensitive policies, and it sounds as if you thought they might be a good idea, and I was wondering if you could talk about the pros and cons of context-sensitive policies.
On the policy level, I can say a little bit about the Philadelphia complete streets classification that they put together. and a lot of other the big metropolitan areas have been looking at this approach. San Francisco's got a very similar classification that looks at, you know, what are your transportation facilities like, but then also what is your land use and context, and giving some more specific design guidance there. I think those have been a good first step.
Yeah, of course, both the policies and the design standards and everything else should be context sensitive. And, you know, a lot of us here operate in the Portland area, but it's got to also work for Washington County, it's got to work for the rural area, and it's not going to be the same answer. And what's a complete street will totally depend on the context. The context, the land use context, obviously determines the use. You know, how many people are out there who even want to get around by any mode. And what destinations are there to get to, including bus stops. Context is also environmental. So when I talked about the triple bottom line, that's 3 different aspects of context. So, but where it really comes home is in the design treatment, that you can have these general policies about what are the priorities for the modes in this segment of street based on functional class and land use context. And then, if you have limited right-of-way, for example, there's different design treatments available that take up more or less space or are more or less expensive. And how you pick those should absolutely be based on the context.
All right, a big thank you for our guests. So please join us next week for Andre Tremoulet's talk about homeless encampments on public right-of-ways. That would be our last seminar of the quarter. Thank you.